Good afternoon, students. Today I will discuss two different theories of investment. One of my last class I discussed some of the theories of investment, but today I am going to discuss two different theories of investment. Please recall our discussion about the investment models. So, when we discussed about investment, we discussed this by linking with the national income, and we linked this component with the effective demand and aggregate demand. So, when we discussed it in terms of aggregate demand, so we started our discussion by considering a two sector model where we have the income or the aggregate demand, which is a component of consumption expenditure and investment expenditure. And this theory is mostly propounded by John Maynard Keynes. So, he mentioned about the investment is the main crucial component that drives the national income in the economy. By the assumption of short run component, the consumption expenditure on various activities that remains constant, because at a short run time period the consumers cannot mobilize adequate resources to enhance their consumption, but at the same time there is a chances or possibility of improving the investment function, or in other words the output can only be improved or enhanced through increasing the aggregate demand. Once the aggregate demand is increased or the aggregate demand function shifts from left to right, it can changes with change in consumption expenditure, it can change with change in investment. However, when we talk about the change in investment or shift in the aggregate demand function, see our consumption expenditure, it remains constant for some time period. So, because we talk mostly on the spontaneous investment, it is the rate of amount of capital formation that mobilizes the investors to invest more and to produce more output. So, that is why we mostly focus on the investment or investment expenditure, and that investment expenditure depends on many exogenous factors. In initial days of discussion or the initial theories of investment, they have discussed about the internal factors or the individual factors that mobilize investment, but this particular theory is discussed in terms of the factors or the various factors or the exogenous factors that is not be under the control of the household or the entrepreneur, and these factors are also influence the aggregate demand. So, that is why a aggregate demand can change with regard to many factors, which we can show in terms of a graph, a national income identity graph. What you can see here in this graph, we are showing about investment demand function, we are showing about national income, and also we are showing about the national income identity in terms of the 45-degree line. You can see this picture clearly that S shows about the saving function, the horizontal line shows about the autonomous investment, which remains constant over a period of time despite of your change in output in the level of in the economy, the level of autonomous investment remains unchanged. So, that is why the investment function remains a straight line, a horizontal straight line. However, there is a increase in the income function because of increase in the investment. In other words, your income can only be increased or the output in the economy can only be increased through increase in the investment function. So, that exercise you can see in the right side of the panel, which is showing that you have a change in income, that is the change in income which is expressed in terms of delta y. Delta stands for change, and the change in income you can see in this figure in terms of y2 and the gap between y2 and y1, that is in terms of E1m and E2m, what you can see here. At the same time, the change in investment which is mentioned in the terms of delta I is E2k or jk. You can see very well in this figure that it talks about when the ratio of income and the ratio of investment, that gives you a multiplier. In other words, it talks about how the outputs in the economy is changing because of the initial level of investment. Investment is made available to the firm in the initial level, but output is produced in continuously over a period of time. So, the multiplier or the investment multiplier is assessing or estimating the total amount of change in output due to change in investment, and in this theory it is assumed that the investment multiplier is always greater than 1. In other words, or it implies the change in income in this economy or output in the economy always higher than the change in investment. Otherwise, no investor will invest if it is a decreasing return to scale or a constant return to scale. Always firm motivate to invest more when there is a increasing returns to scale. So, that is why when you talk about the change in multiplier or change in income with regard to change in investment, it depends on the marginal propensity to consume. So, the marginal propensity to consume is nothing but what is the multiplier effect on consumption because of change in income. So, marginal propensity to consume talks about the rate of change in your consumption expenditure due to change in your income. So, the theory of multiplier or investment multiplier can be explained with help of a table. What you can see here is the firm is investing about 100 millions in the initial stage of the production function, and it is assumed that the marginal propensity to consume is about 0.8, because if you go to the theory of consumption expenditure, the range of marginal propensity to consume is between 0 and 1. It is never cross 1 and it is not never goes down to 0, below 0. In other words, the consumption expenditure increases with increase in income, but the rate of increase in consumption expenditure is less than the rate of increase in income. Otherwise, no output will be formed in the economy. So, in this particular table, it shows that how the initial investment in the first year is accumulating more and more outputs in the successive years. For example, if you see this table, we have 3 columns here. The first one talks about the number of years or the rounds. Second column talks about the consumer spendings. In other words, the amount of consumption expenditure in the economy because of the income, and the third one talks about the income generated in the economy. When you talk about the linking between the consumption expenditure and income, it is implied that if there is a more consumption expenditure in the economy, it will increase the output. In other words, the amount of consumption expenditure is nothing but the amount of output that is created in the economy at a given period of time. So, you can see this table very well. In the initial level of investment is 100 millions. In other words, the income which is generated by the firm in the economy is equal to $100 million. So, out of the income of 100 million, since the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, so 0.8 means the 80% of the income generated is utilized for consumption purpose. In other words, total 80 million are spent on consumption expenditure, which in the next round again utilized for creation of more output or income. Like that, in the second stage, the total amount of output which is produced is 80 million, and again that 80 million is invested, and out of that 80 million investment we got 80 millions of output, and again the 80% of this 80 million again utilized for consumption purpose. It accrues to around 64 million, and like that this process continues till the total amount of income generated is 0. And when you see the third column here, the initial level of investment which is made is 100 million. By the end of the period, it generates 500 millions of income. In other words, you can see it very well. If you spend 100 millions at the initial years, because of increase in your marginal propensity to consume and increase in your consumption expenditure and output in the economy, it is a multiplier effect in terms of increase in output in economy. So, you can see very well here the change in income in terms of the some 500 out from the 100 and the change in income over a period of time, and that ratio will generate to the multiplier. In other words, when you see the expenditure relationship here in terms of some formulas, you can very well understand here. The effective demand or the aggregate demand is nothing but a sum of consumption expenditure and income expenditure. When there is a change in income, because of change in income, you can see here the delta y is the change in income, and because of change in income, there is a continuous effect in terms of to increase in consumption in terms of delta c, and also increase in investment in terms of delta I. In other words, the change in income in the economy is nothing but the sum of total change in consumption expenditure and the sum of investment expenditure. The consumption expenditure is always expressed in terms of a linear form in terms of a plus b y, where Y stands for disposable income, B stands for the coefficient or the coefficient effect of income on consumption expenditure. It is nothing but the marginal propensity to consume, and A stands the initial level of consumption. So, if you write the consumption expenditure accordingly by including the A plus B y, it shows like this: the change in total consumption expenditure in terms of the initial consumption expenditure plus change in consumption expenditure is equal to A plus B y plus B delta I. So, B delta I stands for change in investment and B stands for the coefficient that is associated with the change in investment, and this B tell you how much change in income consumption because of change in the investment. So, if you make a little bit of a change in this particular equation, finally we will get the equation in terms of delta y into 1 minus V, which is equal to delta I. In other words, change in income multiplied by 1 minus B, B stands for marginal propensity to consume, is equal to change in investment. If we make it more simplified by dividing delta y by delta I, then we will get 1 by 1 minus B. So, 1 by 1 minus B is the investment multiplier here. It will talk or it tells about how much investment is contributing to increase in output in the economy. As we discussed continuously, B is nothing but the marginal propensity to consume, and as per the theory, when the B is a marginal propensity to consume, 1 minus B is the marginal propensity to save. In other words, if you rewrite the multiplier here, it gives you 1 by 1 by MPS. In other words, when you talk about the relationship of multiplier or the investment and consumption expenditure and income in the economy, if you have more investment, if you have more consumption expenditure, then there is a more multiplier effect in terms of creation of output. If you see the multiplier 1 by 1 minus 1 by MPS, it means there is a inverse relationship between marginal propensity to save with the income. In other words, if the farms are saving more, then there will be less investment and less output creation. If there is a more consumption, then you have a more output creation and more investment. For example, you can understand this very well in terms of a numerical example, where you have a consumption function like this: C is equal to 100 plus 0.75 y, where 100 stands for the initial level of consumption expenditure or the intercept form, 0.75 stands for marginal propensity to consume, and y stands for disposable income. I is here 200. Now, suppose we will go with a initial level of income where there is no change in investment or consumption expenditure. Then we can write the initial level of income level such as 100 plus 0.75 y 1 plus 200. It talks about the sum of consumption expenditure and investment expenditure. We saw the formula of multiplier here. So, you see, by taking the formula of multiplier here, we can rewrite it in terms of 1 by 1 minus 0.75 into 300. It means 1 by 1 minus 0.75 gives you 1 by 0.25, and that will give you in terms of sum of the 300 income. When we assume that there is an increase in investment by 100, then what will happen? Okay. So, when there is an increase in investment by 100, then the change in income will be in terms of 1 by 1 minus 0.75 into 400. Okay. So, this process will give you the income of 400, with this will tell you the change in investment here by 100, and that leads to a multiplied effect of 4. In other words, if the investment is changing by 100, by keeping a multiplier of 4, there is an increase of output by 4 times, or there is a 4-fold increase in income due to change in investment here. So, the multiplier concept is widely used by Keynes, and the later stage the other economists or the followers of the Keynes to explain about the role of investment in the economy. So, the multiplier or the investment multiplier has two components. One is called as static multiplier and other one is called dynamic multiplier. When we say the static multiplier, in terms of the theory and also in terms of the mathematical notation, it is the rate of multiplier. It shows about change in your investment and income during a single period, one period, basically a 1 year time period. In other words, when you are making a investment in the current year, you will get a change in output in the same year. There is a spontaneous change in your income because of change in of your investment expenditure. However, when you go for a dynamic multiplier is a concept here, the change in income is not based with your change in current year of investment. In other words, investment made in the current year will lead to increase your income in the forthcoming years in the later period. It means if you are spending some investment in time period t, then you will get a output at time period t1, t plus 1, t plus 2 and so on. It means you will create the future stage, you will get more expenditure and income due to the current period of investment. In other words, there is always a time gap or a time lag involves between the change in income and change in investment. They both concepts are not changed in the same time period. We can explain that in detail with a understanding that when a firm is making a investment, all the factors of production cannot change spontaneously. It definitely takes some time for utilization of the resources perfectly, and that leads to an increase in output in the future gap. So, firm always leads some time gap to realize the impact or the efficiency of the investment during that particular time period. However, in a later stage, multiplier theory of investment played a big role or a crucial role in the theory of investment, but it was criticized at the later stage by the monetarist and other economists because of certain leakages. The leakages are explained in terms of the payment of the past debts, purchasing of existing wealth and import of goods and services. Please keep in mind on that when you are spending something in terms of payment of the past debt, it is neither coming your investment or your consumption. So, this is cannot be accumulated in terms of growth of output. So, this is one of the leakage when you talk about the increase in income in the economy. Similarly, when you are purchasing some existing wealth where there is no creation of additional output in the economy. So, we cannot consider this change as an investment. And thirdly, when you are importing some goods and commodities, there is a flow of money from your domestic country to foreign countries, then there is no creation of output in your domestic country. So, because of these reasons, these payments or these monetary flow of resources in the economy can be considered as an investment. These are considered as leakages, and that leads to decline in the output in the economy. And the second main problem or the limitation of this multiplier theory of investment is non-availability of consumer goods and services. Basically, when we assume that the total amount of output produced in the economy is directly goes to the households for the consumption, that might not happen in time. There are many leakages, and because of that the consumer expenditure is not as per the desired level of income. And the third case is full employment situation. When you go to the full employment situation, the classical thinking of the full employment situation where the economy is working under full capacity, where there is no possibility to increase the output further in terms of increasing the cost of production, then there is obviously the increase in investment cannot increase the output. So, that is why because of these reasons, multiplier theory of investment was criticized by many economists. So, another theory which is suggested in against to this multiplier theory of investment is accelerator theory of investment. So, the accelerator theory of investment is talking something the relationship between investment and output in a different way. It is not same way what we talked about the multiplier and case. When we talk about the accelerator theory of investment, it is also talking the relationship between national income and investment, but it is talking investment in terms of the capital stock. When we saw the technology, when we see the capital mode of production, when we see the various ways of increasing the inputs in the economy, then it is the capital that leads to the increase in the output in the economy. So, it is not the investment, rather it is the capital stock or the accumulation of the capital in the economy that leads to the increase in the output. So, the relationship between the capital stock and income that can be explained in terms of the change in capital output ratio, that is delta k by delta y. So, delta k stands for change in capital, delta y stands for change in output. So, this change in capital output is the crucial component to increase the output in the economy. So, this exercise is based on certain assumptions. The first one is you have a production function, that production function is of Kapf-Dollars production function type, where your inputs are generated or expressed in a multiplicative term. All the factors of production are homogeneous and perfectly divisible. Third assumption is about factor market is highly competitive in nature and factor prices are given. Fourth assumption is firms produce with least cost combination of inputs. There is no excess production capacity. Firms' calculation about the future demand is fairly accurate and there is no financial constraint or funds are easily available. Based on these assumptions, the accelerator theory of investment was explained by the economist in terms of certain ratios. Let us think that the accelerator theory of investment in terms of aggregate demand, that is in terms of how much output is produced in the economy and how much capital stock is utilized or used to produce the output in the economy. So, let us use some notations here. YT stands for the amount of output at period t, KT stands for the amount of capital stock at period period t, and K by Y stands for the capital output ratio at current period, and the relationship between the capital stock and output is explained in terms of KT is equal to small k YT. In other words, the small letter k stands for the amount of change in investment or capital. I will tell you explain in detail here. This small letter k is always greater than 1. It means when you increase the capital stock in the economy, good impact in terms of change in income, or the other way, change in capital output ratio which always greater than 1 in the economy. If you have more output in the economy as compared to the capital stock or the expenditure, then firms will motivate to produce more and more. If the k is less than 1, where the amount of expenditure or capital formation is more than the output generated, then no firm will be interested to produce more. So, that capital formation here we can explain in terms of some changes over a period of time. So, let us explain change in income in terms of delta y t plus 1, t stands for one time period, t plus 1 stands for next time period. So, it is nothing but the gap between the income or output between t plus 1 period and t period. Similarly, the desired stock of capital, that is k t plus 1 is also the same way defined as k t plus 1 is equal to k y t plus 1. It means the amount of capital stock in a economy is depends on income of the same period with certain multiplier, that multiplier is k here. So, when you say the k, let us discuss that when the capital is changing over the two periods, time periods, that leads to your change in capital. The same way it also leads to change in your income. So, the change in capital here is nothing but the k times change in income. It means the change in capital in a economy is with a k times the change in income in the economy. So, when we talk about change in capital stock between two time periods, it is nothing but the investment. So, the change in capital stock between two time periods is considered as investment. So, the change in k t plus 1 is nothing but it is investment at the period t plus 1 and which is equal to k times change in your national income or the output. So, here you can see some sort of relationship between investment and change in output in terms of the exercise here. If your change in income is more than 0 or greater than 0, then the level of investment is also greater than 0. If the change in your income is 0 or the no change in production in a particular period of time, then there is no investment in that particular period of time. And the other ways, if you have a decline in output or there is a diminishing return in the economy, then obviously there is no investment furtherwards. No firm will produce any outputs in the economy if there is a diminishing return in the economy. So, this exercise you can explain in terms of gross investment and net investment. The gross investment and net investment is explained in terms of the R or the replacement capital. Replacement capital in other words called as the depreciation which is accrued to the capital stock. It means the sum of net investment plus depreciation leads to the gross investment. Here when we talk about the net investment, we discussed just now is the net income or the net investment is a function of income if the same year with k, and the gross income then written like k delta y t plus 1 plus r t plus 1. So, k delta y t plus 1 stands for change your income in this current year, whereas the depreciation is a constant term that accrues of the period due to wear and tear to the capital stock in that particular period. So, here the k stands for how much change in your investment due to change in income. So, the k in other words called as the accelerator coefficient. It will tell you what is the amount of k leads to how much change in your investment. In other words, it will tell you the change in capital output ratio over a period of time with how much investment is required in the economy to increase output further and further. So, this theory has more relevance in terms of thinking about change in your income over a period of time by mobilizing your capital stock. So, this theory is somehow considered a better theory than the multiplier theory of investment, but still this theory has certain limitations. The first limitation is the theory of investment multiplier depends totally a theoretical framework of the relationship between the capital stock and income. There is no empirical validation of this particular theory in the later stages. The examination of on what extent firms are taking a decision of more and more outputs with regards to the accumulation of capital stock is missing. The second one is there is the firms they face various types of financial constraints, and there may not be the adequate support from the economy in terms of the changing the monetary policy, which can help the firms to improve their financial conditions. So, because of that, there is a less possibility of increasing out capital stock further and further. And third one is the assumption of the constant relative factor prices. When you talk about the change in factor prices, then accordingly it has a adverse effect to the output produced in the economy. So, that factor is not considered while you discussed about the accelerator theory of investment. The next limitation of this particular theory is there is uncertainty regarding the continuance of interest on demand. The demand is not increasing in the economy because of the change in your consumption basket, then it has a negative impact in terms of creation of the output in the economy. The another factor here discussed is in terms of the time lag. When the multiplier theory is discussed in terms of time lag, accelerator theory is silent about discussing about the time lag. There is no discussion about how the past year of capital accumulation can increase to investment in this current year. So, there may be some time lag, and it is well established by the other theories to stating that a capital accumulation is not spontaneous, it cannot increase the output in the same time period. It requires some sort of time lag to make the investment more effective. In other words, the time lag is occurred in the economy because of the absence of excess capacity in the capital goods industry, which leads to low investment in a future time period. The next one limitation of this theory is about the firms that never always form profit maximization behavior. This theory is talking about firms are always depends on the minimum cost principle or profit maximization principle, but which is not always true, because if you see the theories of various types of profit maximization principles of the firms or the equilibrium condition of various types of firms, then there are many discussions about sales maximization in place of profit maximization. In most firms, they believe to how to maximize their sale rather than the profit. Okay, so, that is why this is one of the big limitation of this theory. And lastly, there is a existence of discontinuity or indivisibility in the production function. This theory is assuming that factors of production are indivisible, but that creates a problem in terms of if the factors of production are indivisible, then increase in output in successive time period is absent or totally difficult to increase the output when the firms are unable during the short term time period, they can accumulate more capital further and further. So, these are the few limitations of the accelerator theory of investment. So, I conclude here by stating that both multiplier theory of investment and accelerator theory of investment are crucial in terms of understanding the relationship between income, consumption expenditure and investment expenditure by giving more emphasis to the investment expenditure by stating that it is the investment expenditure which can increase the output over a period of time, and that time period accrues over a time lag, and the firm can enhance the output if both multiplier and accelerator principles work more effectively and efficiently. Thank you very much.